Good morning, everyone, both our live audience here and also online. You're very welcome to our Green City Symposium, Matching the Challenge. First of all, we're this is organized, part of STUE, which stands for Sustainable Transformation of Urban Environments. And we're a multidisciplinary research community and profiling area. And it's funded by the Academy of Finland's Profi 6 funding instrument until 2027. And the PI of this is Professor Liisa Heikkio. And your hosts today are myself, Sofie Pelsmakers, and Nina. And we're part of STUE as well. So I'm associate professor in sustainable architecture and housing design at Tampere University. And I bring experience from the United Kingdom, from Denmark, and now in the last 2 years, Finland as well. Nina.
Yeah, I'm a postdoc researcher in environmental policy here in Tampere, and my specialty is conservation policy.
Thank you. And so STUE is really looking at sustainability of our future cities, future societies, and that it really culminates and happens in cities, in urban areas. And the sustainable transformation calls for cutting-edge, practice-based, multidisciplinary research. And we're really looking for solutions for sustainable urban change, particularly through multidisciplinary research, new concepts, and also community involvement as well. And we're actually aiming to transform cities into safe, resilient, and sustainable living environments that are inclusive, so for people of all ages, ethnicities, and capabilities. And at the same time, when we do this and meet this huge challenge that we face, we're also strengthening Tampere University's research profile as well. You can join us and sign up to the website. I think you have also on the workshop sheets on the table, there's some more information from us as well. Now I'm going to give a very brief introduction just to frame kind of the day, and also Nina will follow on as part of that as well, and we'll tell you a little bit more about what we have planned with you today. So I'm sure that none of you have, it has not escaped any of you, that we've had COP26 happening this week and next week in Glasgow. And what's really important to remember, and how really today is part of this framing, is that in August 2021, the IPCC actually gave a code red. What that means is basically a warning, because climate change is widespread, rapid, intensifying, and some trends are now irreversible. So we already are facing ice melting, we cannot turn back, and sea level rises as well. But the other important message that also was given by the IPCC and also in the discussions with COP26 is that there's still time to actually act and limit further climate change. And that time is now. Now, because we can still shape the future. So this graph, actually, you can see what the emission trajectories could be like. We're now at this moment in time. And you can see that basically we still have, we can still influence the trajectory that we're going to go on. But at the moment, we are actually facing this current trajectory, which is way higher than we're intending. This, I'm not sure how the pointer works, and if people cannot see that online, but if you just see here this band, this is actually the 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius that we're trying to stay below globally. The reason for that is that that's when scientists predict, when we go above it, that the ice sheets start melting, and that's then really irreversible and hugely significant. And so, as I said, we're at the moment, the CO2 emissions are rising at the medium or even high risk global warming scenario, and that's why we've agreed to try to limit that. So, and we have just 5 to 10 years to do that. So what is needed? Well, rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. And that also means we're talking about transformational change. No more small changes will get us there. And that was both by the IPCC and the EU Environment Agency. So we need this restorative transformation. And what that really means is it's no longer good enough to kind of go a bit better than business as usual. We really need to go beyond this, because less bad, being a little bit better than what we've been doing, is just not good enough anymore. An example of this, and those of you living and working in Tampere might be familiar with Vuores in the outskirts. And this is for me an example of what is not actually restorative transformation. These are really very advanced, highly technically well-performing timber constructions for people to live, apartment blocks and housing. But to achieve this, we've exploded thousands of years old rock, and we've actually cut the forest down. So we really have flattened the landscape and little regard for natural habitat. And so we need to work much more restorative to actually create this low energy living in a more sustainable way, because this is not the restorative transformation that we need. So this is another example, particularly related to buildings, given my background, is that you can see in this graph that we tend to have these negative environmental impacts. And when we work to the building regulations, those impacts are greater than when we actually then design green buildings. But you can still see even green buildings are still in the red. They still have some negative impact as well. And when we talk about holistic sustainable architecture, we're aiming, if we're referring to sustainability, for neutral impacts. But actually what we really need when we talk about restorative design is this positive environmental and social impacts. And it's really about undoing the damage, not only from our own interventions in urban areas, but also any previous developments that actually have had this significant impact as well. And I often refer to that actually as super kind of architecture. So some examples of this restorative transformation. This is a project that's now 20 years old in Zurich. It's an MFO park, and I studied this actually when I was at the end of my studies, and I've managed to since visit it, and it's really quite remarkable because what you can see is that it actually is a park that is a vertical kind of park, but rather than trees, they actually created this structure where they have these all these different species grow, which you can see here on this planting map, and then creates also these spaces where people can socialize and spend time together in the city. It provides shading. It also actually provides a lot of privacy as well for the surrounding houses as well, and a huge different seasonal component as well. And it has actually shown to work quite well over time. Another example is Biodiversity, which is a practice led by Kongjang Yu in China. And typically what is happening, not just in China or what has happened, but also in most of the other countries in the world, is that we tend to really channel our waterways into the city and in concrete. And we don't really allow other species to coexist. And a lot of his work is related around sponge cities, and is actually really removing all of these concrete defensible barriers, which should never have been created to begin with, and then creating these accessible waterways for water, other species, but also humans, that then is actually also more resilient to climate change. So it becomes a part of sort of the floodplain of the city, which then puts other areas in the city less at risk. And this is what it looks like at scale. That's the same project as well, and it is really quite remarkable. It also, there's some components here as well of water treatment and so on as well, from drainage, the second process. So, and you can see that it also significantly provides this, it mimics ecosystems, but also actually provides amazing spaces for human beings. So greening the built environment has many benefits. First of all, it supports biodiversity. It also, when we have permeable soil, when we don't cover it, there's also significant carbon sequestration in the soil. And in certain conditions, when we don't place vegetation and trees too close to building facades, it can also actually reduce local pollution, air pollution, and dust particles as well. It can also reduce and delay water runoff, and that then reduces flood risk or the severity of a flood event. And it can also actually reduce the risk of droughts. Other benefits are that it tempers cold winds and can reduce winter space heating energy use. And it can also provide shading and then also evaporative cooling, which is really quite important with increasing heat waves due to changing climate we're facing. And then of course, also in some cities in the world related to urban heat island effects as well. And of course, all of that then in turn actually reduces energy use, but also enhances people's well-being as well. And then we also have these other health impacts. So visual and physical access and contact with greenery supports health and well-being. For example, there's fewer people that die in heat waves. It reduces physiological markers of stress. It improves mood and mental well-being, also encourages outdoor activities, so more active lifestyles as well, which then also actually supports social infrastructure. And it also improves the immune system, and it facilitates, as I said, social interaction as well. There is, though, more evidence needed of the actual value and performance, if you like, of green areas on health and well-being, particularly in urban areas as well. But we'll hear some of these issues today and the benefits of greenery as well, and particularly also tonight. So rewilding our cities is crucial, but it cannot be tokenism. And I quickly wanted to show you what we're not looking for. For example, this is Jean Nouvel and Patrick Leblanc, who's a botanist. Their design, Musée Broglie in Paris. And these are my pictures when I took them at the time of when the museum was built, not long after. And I don't know how well you can see, but at the very top, you already have plants that are starting to die because it needs regular maintenance and replacement, particularly the cold winds. And they've also imported plants from the different continents. So climatically, they're not very well suited. So we must stop doing this because this is actually what then it looks like. Depending on when you visit, you might see it really beautiful like the images, but this is when I visited it, what it actually was like. Another example is Paradise Park, a London nursery. This was the vision the architects had. And this is actually what it looked like when I visited it. It all had died because it needs this continuous maintenance and nutrients that get recycled. Also, plants are forced to grow with their roots horizontal rather than vertical in the soil. They often don't even have much soil, just sort of woolen pockets. And as I said, it needs this continuous water and irrigation, and that also has huge energy and carbon costs as well. So overall, there's a high maintenance involved. Many plants fail. And then the question is, of course, what benefit does even the original project have, even if it's successful, related to people and biodiversity and all of these other well-being aspects and benefits that I mentioned before? They have since replaced it with cement concrete panels, and they're making trees grow from the ground up, which is more successful. But all of this is, of course, hugely unsustainable, and we have to avoid creating spaces like that. Far better to actually prepare in different ways and grow from the ground up rather than the gimmicks. And at the moment, a lot of this greenery is actually really trendy. And the question is really, how sustainable is it? From the examples that I just showed you, also in Milan, Boere Studio, Bosco Verticale, you might be familiar with it. It's actually quite amazing because in the city, everybody knows about this building, even those that are not into architecture. It's a landmark. So people meet there, they know where it is located. But it needs these continuous cranes on the top to replace the trees. They actually grow quite fast on some of the facades. They don't grow straight, so they all need to be guided with steel wires. And again, it's high maintenance. It's also incredibly expensive to live there. Needs continuous circulation of water and so on. And also daylight and balcony size are compromised. And it's not just in Europe we're making these mistakes. It's in China. The city forest garden is 800 or more flats were built, looks really pretty remarkable, but then actually there was a mosquito infestation. The plants kind of were so happy they grew out of control, and actually in the end very few people moved in. It's not sustainable when we create spaces that don't work or then actually are problematic as well, despite our best intentions. So how can we achieve rewilding of our cities that actually works in reality and at different scales? And this is really what we want to explore here today together with you. Before I hand over to Nina, I just want to say that our green transition must be inclusive and accessible to all, including non-humans. And she'll talk more about that.
Thank you. Which one? This one is the next slide. Yes. After many years of doing research on nature conservation, I'm still struggling to find the best graphs or other short ways to convey the urgency and scale of biodiversity loss. And maybe the photo of the declining willow tit, which is a common forest bird in Finland, but it's strongly declining. Maybe that is better than the other graphs I have today. I don't know. But anyway, biodiversity loss is happening everywhere in the world for all kinds of non-human species, all kinds of habitats, and it happens in rare, remote ecosystems, but also parks and forests in Tampere. And I'm sure everyone in the audience knows this already, this decline and the crisis, but sometimes I think we all lose focus on the scale and the urgency and the changes needed. So I have a couple of graphs and slides to remind us why we are here today, also for for the non-humans. And but otherwise, we are going to focus more on the solutions and actions today. This is one graph. Sometimes I think the climate crisis have still maybe better graphs than the biodiversity crisis. This shows the living planet index. And even though the awareness about biodiversity loss is higher than ever, Europe is not doing better than other continents. For example, the living planet index in Europe is minus 24% for all species. And this is just one way to try to convey the scale of the problem. And if climate crisis is partly reversible, species extinctions are not reversible. And these indexes all show that also our actions for biodiversity, they are not enough at the moment, and we need to do better. And there are many ways to categorize more specifically the threats. This is one recent graph from this European report on the state of nature in Europe. And it's not shown on this graph, but the biggest threat in Europe, accounting for more than half, is land use changes, which also happens in the urban areas. And there's also a lot of other kind of pressures. And the last graph is maybe so far my favorite. It illustrates how the business as usual, the gray curve, what we have now is not enough to reverse biodiversity loss. Increasing usual conservation efforts, the yellow curve, that is not enough either. This means, for example, thinking that it's enough to have more conservation areas somewhere outside cities, let's say, but that's not enough either. We need to change production and consumption patterns too, and have greener cities to get back on the green curve. And since cities are major drivers of change, and we have the possibility to host a lot more biodiversity and non-humans here. And today we will discuss more about how that happens. Okay. And the program today, just to go through it briefly, and you have the papers on the table showing that we have 2 keynote speakers and a short break between. Then we have a lunch break. Lunch is in Frenkel, and I will lead the group there if you don't know where it is. And it's free for the participants. And then we are doing workshop in small groups here and also in Zoom. And then we have closing words and some cocktails. And then you're welcome to stay for the evening event also. And shortly on housekeeping, the keynote sessions will be recorded, but not the small group discussions. And also the questions will be recorded, I suppose, yes. And so we have the chat for asking questions in the Zoom, and face-to-face, we have two people passing 2 microphones here. And if you are uncomfortable asking a question in English, you can ask it in Finnish, and I will do my best to translate it in English. And we have a tag on Twitter too. Yeah. Guess that's end of our part.
Actually, one thing I forgot to ask, I assume that there's Wi-Fi here. Do we have the details we can pass to the delegates that are in the room in case that they do want to tweet and so on? So if I can just ask that, we'll do this at a later stage. But I think that I am now ready to welcome our first keynote speaker. One of the things that I think was such a good message you gave as well, that some aspects of climate change might be reversible, not all, at least not in our generation or several generations, but species decline isn't. And this leads me to the honor of welcoming Professor Matthew Gandy, who is Professor of Geography at the University of Cambridge and an award-winning documentary filmmaker. His books include The Fabric of Space, Water, Modernity, and the Urban Imagination by MIT Press. And he has another new book as well called Natura Urbana, Ecological Constellations in Urban Space. Today, he will talk about citizens, denizens, and urban ecology, sharing space with non-human others. In this presentation, he will explore different facets to urban nature. He will consider 4 perspectives in particular: systems-based approaches, observational paradigms, urban political ecology, and what he terms the ecological pluriverse. So please warmly welcome Professor Matthew Gandy. Welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, and I hope that the sound is fine. I'm assuming.
Yes.
So
yes.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I'll try to do now is to share my screen with my presentation. So just give me one moment. Great, I think that's working. Please do let me know if there are any glitches with the internet connection or any technical problems, but I'm assuming that's fine. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this extremely important conference. Just listening to the introductory remarks really makes it so clear why these questions are so vital for us. In my own work, I've focused more on biodiversity, and in particular urban biodiversity, and that's going to be the focus of my presentation today. And it also relates to a book which is about to come out under the title Natura Urbana, Ecological Constellations in Urban Space. And what I'm going to do today is to draw on some aspects of the introduction to my new book, where I try to make sense of the complexity of urban nature. And in order to do so, I'm suggesting that we can make a distinction between 4 main areas of thought in relation to urban nature. Now, I should stress that this is really my working typology, and you may, in the audience, you may have different perspectives really on how we handle this vast and growing literature in relation to urban nature. So in my presentation then, I'm going to really outline what I mean by these different approaches. So I'm going to start with looking at systems-based urban ecology, which I want to stress is the dominant approach to understanding and working with urban nature. The second approach, observational paradigms, is much more closely related to the natural history and the history of interacting directly with interesting aspects of fauna and flora in cities. The third approach, urban political ecology, which is an intellectual field which my own work has been quite closely associated with, and has certain connections to critical urban theory and much more politically engaged approaches to looking at urban nature questions. And then fourthly, what I refer to as the ecological pluriverse really refers to a range of contemporary approaches to bring non-human others into a much more central role in relation to urban policy, urban design, and urban environmental thinking. So, to begin then, the systems-based approach. Now, if we were to try to sketch a history of systems-based approaches, the Chicago School of Urban Sociology features quite prominently in terms of using various metaphors such as plant succession and other botanical metaphors to try and understand processes of change in the capitalist city. But I want to stress, however, that the Chicago School of Urban Sociology is not really about ecology at all. It was very much about applying scientific metaphors to the study of cities and to look at, if you like, more clear connections between systems-based urban ecologies and the ecological structure or function of cities. I think we need to look at slightly different bodies of literature. And among the sources that really stand out are, for example, the work of Paul Duvigneau and the so-called Brussels School of Ecology. Duvigneau was a tropical ecologist who, particularly from the 1970s onwards, devoted his attention to trying to understand the metabolic structure and function of Brussels as a metropolitan space. And Duvigneau was very much interested in questions of biomass and trying to effectively study a modern metropolis as if it was a study of a tropical rainforest or another kind of non-urban ecosystem in terms of the flows of energy and biomass within urban space. So Duvigneau then very interested in conceptualizing urban space as this intricate, interconnected set of flows and transformations. Now, this systems-based approach with a heavy emphasis on the quantification of flows and cycles within urban space has also been developed quite prominently in North America, where a series of studies have sought to take urban ecosystems more seriously as a focus of scientific analysis. And particular cities such as Phoenix and Baltimore really stand out in terms of this evolving research paradigm in relation to urban ecologies. Now, this body of work, and these are just a couple of examples, John Martzlove, Marina Alberti, and other scholars, these are just a couple of examples of a rapidly growing field of literature, which I would suggest is effectively dominant in relation to how we conceptualize urban ecology and urban nature. And among the various research programs here, the Baltimore School of Urban Ecology is particularly prominent. And interestingly, the Baltimore School actually see themselves as direct successors of the Chicago School of Urban Sociology from the 1920s and 1930s. So in a way, this field of work has its own particular historiography in terms of how urban ecosystems can or should be conceptualized. And this dominant systems-based paradigm has strong links to resilience discourse, landscape urbanism, which is very prominent in North America. Within this literature, there's a strong emphasis on various kinds of epistemological unity between the biophysical and social sciences. So in all of these models, diagrams, and intellectual contributions, this very strong emphasis on a unified methodological and conceptual framework. So this first of these four areas of thought then is, I would suggest, the dominant approach with a vast and growing literature. Now, a second approach, which I'm referring to as observational paradigms, this is very much connected with early observations of unusual flora and fauna in cities, and especially unusual botanical assemblages. In the 19th century, for example, there was growing interest in unusual plants or unusual combinations of plants growing on ruins, for example, and waste spaces. And one of the early studies, which has subsequently become a classic study in urban botany, is Richard Deakin's Flora of the Colosseum in Rome, published in 1855. Really fascinating book. And you can see simply in the way the book represents urban space, this fascination with the intricate spaces of ruins and their distinctive ecological assemblages. And in this book, Deakin notes over 400 different species of plants growing on the ruins of the Colosseum, including many unusual plants not recorded anywhere else in Europe. The possibility, for example, that some of these unusual species reflected the trade routes of the Roman Empire, speculatively even seeds in the fur of gladiatorial animals and other possible mechanisms by which these seeds could have arrived. Interestingly, within a broader context of thinking about urban ecology, that with the unification of the modern Italian state in the 1870s, the Colosseum was cleaned up, and most of these interesting ecological assemblages were removed. So in this sense, then a very specific historical moment captured in the history of urban botany. Other examples in the 19th century that caught the attention of botanists are the so-called ballast floras of port cities, and plants associated with shipping routes became also a focus of interest. A number of early studies exist of industrial floras in Germany and Switzerland, for example, where botanists, instead of going out into the countryside, so to speak, or into rural areas, became amazed by the range of species to be found in urban and industrial areas. So urban botany then really beginning to take shape as a distinctive field of work. Now, it's particularly in the post-war period, from the 1940s onwards, that the distinctiveness of the observational paradigm begins to gain strength with a wider range of studies and people becoming involved. And one of the interesting reasons for this is that the aerial warfare produced unusual ecologies, the so-called bomb sites of London, or the Trümmerlandschaften in German cities equally, became the focus of intense botanical and ecological interest. So one of the first books on the natural history of London, Richard Fitter's Natural History, from I think it was 1946 when it was published, Fitter's book devotes quite a lot of space to discussing these unusual botanical assemblages on bomb sites. And another European city which also was the focus of intense ecological interest was post-war Berlin. And what we could perhaps refer to as the Berlin School of Urban Ecologies rested on the systematic study of these unusual urban spaces. And figures such as Herbert Zukop and Ingo Kovarik may be familiar to some of you, but some of the most prominent ecologists, urban ecologists, have emerged from this particular paradigm of studying unusual urban spaces. And in the Berlin context, there were certain plants that really flourished in these stony rubble places. such as Chenopodium botrys on the left here, very distinctive plant, a Mediterranean plant that thrived in these hot, stony urban environments. And of course, as the city has been steadily redeveloped in recent years, many of these marginal spaces have disappeared. And in my own research in Berlin, it was actually very difficult to locate any examples of this key plant within the history of urban botany within Berlin. So there's a very particular history and set of circumstances around these different urban ecologies. I want also to emphasize that the Berlin School of Urban Ecology, based at the Technical University in Berlin, had one of the most remarkable research programs for urban nature that has yet emerged in the island city of West Berlin, in the divided city, a biotope mapping regime, as the sociologist Jens Lackermann refers to it, this biotope mapping regime, which involved this intricate survey of all of the different biotopes across the island city of West Berlin. And in addition to this biotope mapping program, ecologists such as Ingo Kovarik also developed typologies for different kinds of urban natures. And Kovarik introduces the term fourth nature to refer to wild or spontaneous forms of urban nature. And in my own research in Berlin, particular sites have been extremely significant. A large so-called Brache or wasteland in the Chausseestraße in Berlin, with this enormous diversity of flora and also unusual invertebrates as well. This moth, top left, Cuculia fraudatrix, actually is originally from Russia, from dry grasslands or steppes in Russia, and has spread through urban and industrial wastelands in Germany and elsewhere. So this site, for example, a focus of my own research, and in about 2014, the site was completely cleared to build luxury housing, ironically called The Garden. So this intricate space is lost now, and I'm currently writing an essay which is trying to reconstruct aspects of ecological memory in relation to this particular site. And as these marginal spaces have been lost, we have a slightly odd situation in cities such as Berlin, where some aspects of urban design have sought to either protect small fragments of these urban wastelands or recreate a specific kind of ecological aesthetic. So this is Park am Gleisdreieck in Berlin, and there's a kind of stony rubble substrate that's laid out to encourage some of the typical plants to grow that were associated with these unusual post-war landscapes. So these kind of mimic ecologies within the heart of the city. Now, within the ecological literature, within this broad-based observational paradigm, there's been a lot of emphasis on novel ecosystems and recombinant ecologies. And interest, for example, in London, the rose-ringed parakeet is now well established and forms part of the avian fauna of the city. And for people studying these new urban ecologies, then, this particular interest in recombinant ecologies, and also a number of debates within the ecological literature about cosmopolitan ecologies that are effectively global in many respects, and then these discourses about invasive ecologies, and very contentious discussions in relation to specific species, such as parakeets, about whether there's a need to remove these cosmopolitan species, or understand that this is the new nature of urban ecology. So these debates go on across different aspects of flora and fauna. We also find in relation to urban space a recognition that urban biodiversity is often significantly higher than in rural or agricultural areas, particularly those monocultural landscapes which are near to cities. So a lot of interest in the high levels of biodiversity to be found in cities, and also the possibilities to protect or enhance urban biodiversity. And among the interesting contributions here, I think, is the French landscape designer Gilles Clément, who has worked with his notion of the garden in movement and actually celebrating spontaneous ecological dynamics in relation to landscape design. And he's also included various kinds of ecological refugia within his design. So Parc Henri Matisse in Lille has this very interesting concrete plinth, which is inaccessible, and for Clément is a kind of ecological protection zone, an ecological refugia within the heart of the city. So it's a symbolic element within this landscape design. Also, I should mention, in relation to observational paradigms, the work of artists is very prominent as well. So Maria Teresa Alves has done a series of fascinating studies looking at these traces of global ecologies within a series of port cities, for example. I mentioned earlier in the presentation so-called ballast floras, and these traces of seeds and plants that reflect global shipping routes. Alves has also worked with these ballast floras and port floras, but in terms of a larger discussion about the history of modernity, former slave routes, colonialism, and how this feeds into a much richer and deeper understanding of urban botany and urban ecology. So I want to move on now to the third element here, which of urban political ecology, which is now quite a well-established field within geography, sociology, urban studies, and other related areas of work. Urban political ecology, as I suggested in my introductory remarks, is linked to critical, theoretical, and also neo-Marxian perspectives on urban history and urban change. And the emphasis of this broad body of work, particularly in what we might refer to as the first wave of urban political ecology, which in many ways is encapsulated in this edited collection in The Nature of Cities from 2006. This first wave then of urban political ecology has a number of identifiable strands. We can pick up on the influence of political ecology, particularly from studies of resource conflict in the global south. And in many ways, urban political ecology marks the shift of this neo-Marxian paradigm from the global south to the global north, and also to cities and cities of the global north. So a shift of emphasis. We can also detect connections with radical strands of urban and environmental history. And I would suggest, for example, that Engels' dramatic descriptions of industrial Manchester in the 1840s forms part of this earlier historiographic lineage in terms of directly encountering and seeking to understand urban environments, and particularly questions of health, pollution, living and working conditions, and things of that kind. We can also, in terms of the urban political ecology paradigm, we can detect the influence of the so-called Frankfurt School of sociology and radical critiques of science and technology, and the challenge, if you like, to the assumed neutrality of science and technology within the policy arena. We can also pick up on, I mentioned the question of biomass, for example, Paul Duvigneau and others, but we can also pick up on a different perspective on urban metabolism that moves beyond questions of biomass and measurement, but a focus on urban metabolism that is interested in the circulatory dynamics of capital, as well as water or other material elements of urban environments. So if you like, a multi-layered circulatory conceptualization of urban space, and really bringing these strands together and linking with this photograph here from 1969 in New York City, and the origins of the environmental justice movement, and the way that the urban political ecology literature has been particularly interested in understanding questions around racism, inadequate housing, toxic environments, and a host of other issues that have been to some degree neglected or overlooked within the systems-based paradigm that I began the presentation with. But this field, though, of urban political ecology is itself undergoing a transition now. And I just want to very briefly flag with you some of the areas where the urban political ecology field is facing particular intellectual challenges in terms of future directions. I think one aspect which I find intriguing really is that the urban political ecology literature, by and large, has not engaged very much with ecological literature, in that sense that the urban political ecology literature has, to a certain degree, been quite remote from key scientific developments within ecology and also the biological sciences as well. And one thing that interests me is the possibility to bring together the radical perspectives of urban political ecology with new insights in relation to epigenetics, toxicology, and other fields that, in my view, if you wanted to, for example, look in more detail at the phenomenon of light pollution and its effects on ecology and circadian rhythms, then we need both fields. We need the biophysical sciences, and we need the radical insights of urban political ecology. Also, in relation to urban political ecology, there are some concerns about how to incorporate more complex ideas in relation to agency, that if we look beyond human agency and try to include non-human others, then we need a more elaborate or sophisticated understanding of agency. Also, in terms of urban political ecology, a whole series of interesting debates about cities and scale. And this also relates to the challenge of urban epidemiology, which of course is very prominent at the moment in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic, and trying to think through the relationships between the so-called zoonotic transfer zones, which are related to resource depletion and the impact on urban spaces in terms of exacerbating existing inequalities and so on, so that we have then the possibility to bring together these different fields in interesting ways. And just on this question of urban epidemiology, a quick illustration for you, the spread of West Nile virus, which is spread by a species of mosquito that has flourished in relation to changing urban topographies associated with foreclosure on properties and abandoned swimming pools, and very interesting work bringing together the circulatory dynamics underlying changing topographies of urban space and then questions of entomology, ecology, and urban epidemiology. So it's, in my view, it's an underexplored field that seems like a natural area to look at. And then perhaps just to suggest one other possible field for urban political ecology to grapple with. Some of you in the audience may be aware of the growth of so-called new materialisms and speculative realism, and a number of new approaches to understanding agency and nature. But it occurs to me that urban political ecology might be able to delineate a kind of alternative to some of these perspectives, something which I've referred to as forensic ecologies. And just to give an illustration here, in my own work recently, I've been fascinated in trying to think through how we might link the forensic architecture school led by Eyal Weizmann as an interdisciplinary approach to the interpretation of events in very, very interesting body of work with established approaches such as forensic entomology to make sense of crime scenes. And through a kind of forensic ecologies approach, we can begin to focus more on the role of organisms as sensors or sentinels that can tell us what is happening in terms of global environmental change. In the introductory remarks before my presentation, we heard about biodiversity decline, and within that pattern of biodiversity decline, we can track the role of individual species and how they respond to environmental change. And there is also, of course, the possibility to link with citizen science as well, and to reconfigure different patterns of expertise in relation to emerging forensic ecologies, which in my view presents a different kind of intellectual paradigm to some of the new materialist or speculative realism approaches that are now very popular within geography, anthropology, and other fields. And so finally, because I think my time is beginning to run out, so I'm just going to move on now to my fourth area of thinking about urban nature, that of the ecological pluriverse. And in this sense, I'm suggesting that there's been an attempt to rethink how we relate to non-human others in urban space. And if we were to sketch this emerging alternative perspective, as it were, one of the key early interventions is from the geographer Jennifer Walsh and her path-breaking essay, Zoopolis, published in 1996. And one of the inspirations for Walsh's essay was the return of coyotes to Los Angeles, and a widespread both scientific and public debate about the changing face of metropolitan nature and thinking about ways of living with non-human others within urban space. And that for Walsh then, she uses this expression, re-enchantment, that this recognition of non-human others has a significant role in expanding our conception, not just of urban space, but also human societies as well, in multiple directions in terms of, she talks about ethics and practice in relation to animals. And I might mention in passing the politics of food and how we relate to non-human others in terms of food production raises very profound questions in terms of ethics, naturally, but also epidemiology as well, and health. And that's maybe a topic that might come up during today's discussions. Now, I've mentioned coyotes returning to Los Angeles. In London, foxes have become increasingly common. Wolves returning to European cities. I know that Finland has quite a few wolves, which perhaps we could talk about later. And in Indian cities, leopards also on the urban fringe. And I just want to quickly mention the complexity of leopard ecologies in Mumbai and other Indian cities, that rabies, very serious illness, often fatal, rabies is usually carried by stray dogs in Indian cities. Leopards, however, have a key role in keeping down stray dog populations. So we have this unusual kind of leopard stray dog ecological assemblage, which is something which is an interesting way of trying to interpret what some of these ecological assemblages mean in a broader urban context. Now, this question of animals in cities has also been linked to ethical and philosophical debates over the right of non-human others to urban space. And the term urban denizens has been used as an alternative to the notion of citizens to include non-human others. And just to give an illustration of this, in Paris, the Zoopolis movement has put up a number of posters on the Paris metro seeking to stop the control of rats, for example. The basis being that rats are intelligent, they have feelings, they live in complex social communities. Fundamentally, why can't we just leave them alone? Is there really a need to seek to eliminate non-human others within urban space? And that might be a talking point potentially later in today's conference, in terms of which species we might welcome and why, and how we rationalize decisions about potential interventions in relation to ecological relations and ecological processes. And certainly when it comes to the protection of particular species, philosophers such as Claire Palmer have really emphasized how our way of conceptualizing nature is quite often context specific. We might make some obvious observations here between the idea of a rat or a dog perhaps as a pet, and then our attitude towards feral or stray animals, and these different distinctions that are made between different categories of life within urban space. And then the question of urban rewilding was mentioned earlier, which is really a very fascinating topic, I think. And the Oostvaardersplassen project in the Netherlands is perhaps one of the most prominent large-scale rewilding experiments near to a metropolitan area. And among the various dimensions of this project, which many of you might be familiar with, there was a scientific pretext to not intervene, to really observe and understand a kind of spontaneous rewilding project and let it follow its own course. However, for a combination of reasons, the horses that were such a popular and prominent part of this rewilding project, during one period of time, many of them began to starve. So that people began trying to feed the animals through the perimeter of the reserve, and very fierce debates were provoked between, if you like, the public cultures of nature and the notion of a scientific rewilding experiment. So complex things were raised. And I would perhaps just, before I conclude my presentation, one other example that I came across when I was completing my book was a town north of Paris, and a stag chased by hunters took refuge in a suburban front garden. And as the hunters closed in and their dogs closed in on this stag, local people poured out of their homes to try to protect the animal from being killed. And there was a kind of dramatic standoff, which the hunters prevailed over, but it nevertheless captured a clash of cultures of nature between an ordinary suburban space and a very different perspective as through the organized hunting of wild animals. And this was a very interesting clash of cultures of nature, I think, occurring near to a metropolitan space. So to conclude then, I've suggested that the systems-based paradigm is the dominant approach, aligning very strongly with landscape urbanism, resilience discourse, and so on, and also extending to debates around ecological services, certain river restoration type projects, maybe the sponge cities example that we saw earlier. And underlying this dominant systems-based paradigm is an assumption that some kind of epistemological and methodological unity is both possible and desirable. So one question really that I would put out there is, can we really achieve this kind of conceptual unity? Or is there a danger that important questions or historical tensions would be subsumed within this universalist epistemological approach, and whether we need a different way of conceptualizing differences in terms of conceptual and methodological framing, and whether indeed the systems-based paradigm is the only way to achieve some form of interdisciplinary research. Maybe there are other approaches, and I would suggest that there are. I also want to suggest that we've been thinking a bit about non-human others in urban space. And one of the interesting debates at the moment concerns expanded conceptions of non-human labour. And my colleague Maan Barua, for example, at Cambridge, has done very interesting work on this, as has Marion Ehrenwein, the geographer based at the Open University. And the idea here being that if we want to bring a kind of radical approach to understanding urban space, we need to look at work and labour extending to plants and animals. So in the field of animals, for example, the history of cities has a very rich body of work on working animals, the working horse of the 19th century city, and so on. So the work that animals do, and of course links to food production and other areas that I briefly mentioned. But plants also, we could argue, are doing various kinds of work or labour in relation to urban space, whether that's, for example, trees providing shade or modifying microclimatic conditions, whether it's landscape design initiatives or water purification initiatives that explicitly enlist the role and work of plants within the design paradigm. And I guess also I mentioned the urban political ecology approach, which is quite close to my own work, and the sense that this field is at a crossroads, and the possibility for a renewed urban political ecology and what this might bring to the broader field of studying urban nature. But I also hinted that at the moment, there are some unresolved questions or tensions between the urban political ecology approach, which has a particular emphasis on historical agency in the sense of collective human agency, which of course is vitally important, but does not necessarily align with expanded conceptions of non-human agency and non-human others within urban space. And the question for me then would be, can we hold on to this notion of some form of historical agency and changing cities, changing society, and in some way enlist a richer understanding of non-human others and non-human agency within that process? So I'll leave it there. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. Wow. As an architect, a lot of these things were actually quite new because we tend to operate in sort of the examples we have about the system-based approaches. I perhaps have a few comments or questions for Matthew, but I want to open this up, of course, to all of you here. I don't think, Matthew, you can see the audience, but there's about 40 or so of us sitting around tables. And then I don't know how many we have online. And obviously, people will be in different locations. But let's not forget as well, online, if there's any questions that they can be passed around. But really just opening up to the audience here for any immediate comments, thoughts, questions that you may have. While you think about it, I just was going to say that one of the awesome things of organizing or being part of organizing an event like this is we can get to invite the speakers we really want to hear from. And I'm so pleased you set the scene for us today. I don't see any questions just yet. Anything online?
No.
Okay.
No, we don't have any question online yet.
Yeah, not online, but we have, yeah, go on.
Hi, do you hear me? I'm Jere Nieminen from the Wild Zone NGO, and I want to ask about those spontaneous natural processes which you are talking a lot. I think cities are full of common or invasive species which are bad for biodiversity in many cases. For example, I have been doing urban meadows by sowing the seeds of threatened or rare local plants. And we have to do weeding all the time because otherwise we will lose those meadows of rare species. So I think we also need not freedom to nature, but control and design for the sake of biodiversity.
Sure. Can I quickly respond to that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, sure. I think you raise an interesting point. I mean, within urban areas, there are sometimes so-called relic ecologies. Perhaps these meadows you refer to reflect a previous kind of cultural landscape. And the focus here is to try to protect or recreate something that's been in place for a long time, perhaps. But I think in broader terms, however, I think I probably take a different approach in the sense that I think that cosmopolitan ecologies, as in global ecologies, are often fascinating on their own terms and are often aesthetically also fascinating as well as ecologically. And I think if we are going to have a discourse about invasive species, then I think we need to have a spectrum where we can actually have a serious discussion about which species are not in any sense a problem and could be welcomed and very interesting to have in urban space. And then perhaps focus on those species where there is clear evidence that they might present some kind of specific problem. So I think I would be worried about a discourse which had an extremely kind of strict or almost obsessional distinction between so-called native or non-native species in the context of urban ecologies.
Thank you so much. Is that you satisfied? Yes, nodding here, because of course I can see the audience. You're actually, I'm looking at you now, so I think you can see me now, Matthew, but you're actually on a large projection screen where everybody can see you. So I'm tempted to just talk to the screen, but then I have my head facing you. But we basically have, I think, an online question as well. So I think Raul will.
Yeah, we have a participant who wants to talk. Please, Eva, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, yes, thank you very much. It's Eva Berglund. I'm from Aalto University in Helsinki. And I really loved having a typology of this field, which is quite difficult to get one's head around. And one question I have is, do we need to think about UPE, urban political ecology, as coming from a Marxist background? Or could it be imagined simply as a kind of democratic epistemology of bringing in the stories that haven't been brought in by the mainstream. Because I worry that sometimes if we use that M word, politically, it can be quite tricky. I also have I'd love to see if you have any, maybe I can come back to this later, the ecological pluriverse idea, I think is wonderful because it seems to get to grips with the kind of, to get away from a naive celebration of the multi-species in noticing that there are communities, and those communities are somehow territorial and might include humans and non-humans. But I wonder how far we can go with ecological pluriverse coming back to sort of politics, because we all live in a kind of global universe as well as presumably ecological pluriverses. But anyway, thank you very much. Really inspiring talk.
Thanks, Eva. Yeah, great questions. I mean, I think that the first point about urban political ecology is a really interesting one, because as academics or indeed kind of urban nature writers, we're sort of facing in different directions. And the whole question of the modification of neo-Marxian theory is, of course, a vibrant intellectual field, which potentially crashes and burns in the sort of public discourse, sort of public arena. We know that's the case. And I guess if I was trying to have a conversation with a politician about protecting urban nature, I wouldn't start off by saying, and here's a really good neo-Marxian angle. So I think we have to be conscious of these different intellectual spheres or audiences that we're interacting with. However, on the question of urban political ecology, the flow of money or capital is clearly a connecting thread. And in some of my other work, I've simply used the expression follow the money in relation to forensic ecologies, and everyone understands what that means. So when we're talking, for example, about corruption and cronyism and environmental destruction and circumventing international laws to protect international species, or illegal timber imports for furniture making, all of these other things, everybody understands that. And I think in a way, follow the money might be a better expression to reconfigure what we mean by maybe urban political ecology. Now, the ecological pluriverse notion, I should mention that it took me a really long time to arrive at this notion of 4 main angles on urban nature. I think I must have rewritten my introduction about 50 times before I finally thought, I think I've got this now, what I'm trying to say. And with the ecological pluriverse, and which was partly influenced by reading Escobar's work, and particularly works from anthropology, I think it's a really interesting possibility to develop a more nuanced sense of relating to non-human others, but not a kind of naive sense that any life form must be allowed to flourish, because as soon as you move into the field of urban epidemiology, that raises a question. Do we want various zoonoses, West Nile virus, COVID-19? Do they have a right to flourish as much? We have to take a sensible approach here. And another expression that I've used in recent work is that of an affirmative biopolitical paradigm. And by using this expression, affirmative biopolitical paradigm, I want to make explicit that we do intervene in relation to ecosystems and ecological processes or relations, that we make reflective judgments, not always, but we can make reflective judgments about how, when, and why to intervene to either protect human societies or indeed allow wider ecological assemblages to flourish. So it's partly a question of reflection and thinking through what it is we're doing and why we're doing it.
Thank you so much for that. Eva, are you still there?
Thank you very much.
Okay, great. We have maybe time for 1, perhaps 2 more questions, depends. Just checking if anybody would like to, yeah?
I just thought to mention that I will talk about this negotiation and renegotiation, how to live together later tonight. So tune in.
Yeah, stay on, basically. Yeah. I thought, Matthew, if there's no immediate question, I can be cheeky, right? I can ask, maybe not so much of a question, but something that I thought was quite, well, many things were thought-provoking. But for example, you started the, trying to look now from my notes, which are very, very messy. You gave the quote for the ecological pluriverse, you gave the quote by Jennifer Walsh. And what I thought was very interesting, it's actually saying that we should denaturalize the city and then invite the animals back in, which is something I think, this notion of denaturalization, if you maybe could say something about that as well, because I think often we just think we need to have more of it, we expand it, we enhance it, we don't tend to talk about it as denaturalizing things. So I sort of took it almost like we have to get rid of what we have and then start again. Which I sort of hadn't quite expected. That's what perhaps is also going to be really difficult for as a transformation what needs to happen. So could you maybe elaborate on that for a couple of minutes, if you can?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that partly what Walsh is really getting at is a sense of understanding that nature and ecological processes are ongoing, if you like, irrespective of human intentionality, and that I think what she's arguing for is a degree of openness towards non-human others, and in certain circumstances, protecting or even enhancing those possibilities. And one of the inspirations really for my recent work is noticing these spontaneous urban ecologies, the way that a small patch of ground becomes a focus of a potentially intense botanical interest, and also the notion that nature is all around us. What does it mean to be more aware of urban nature? Another expression I've used is that of attentive observation. And in my other life, so to speak, I'm an entomologist. I'm very interested in insects particularly, and I'm always looking out for things. If I'm walking through parks, streets, anywhere in cities, I'm always on the lookout for interesting or unexpected things. And one of the questions for me is, if we develop a more kind of intense connection with urban nature, that we start to recognize all of these different plants or invertebrates. We notice signs of mammals, for example. We recognize birdsong. We begin to recognize urban micro-seasons, another interesting field. What are the wider implications in terms of social and political discourse if we have this much more engaged interaction with urban space, which is also, I think, for Walsh and others, a space of imagination, because it's, when we're talking about architecture, design, environmental themes, we're also talking about imagining alternative possibilities or alternative worlds.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for that. I think we have to wrap it up now, but maybe I could bring back some of the last things you said to perhaps the first question, that this denaturalization then is perhaps the notion that nature exists in many different ways and places and accidental. And at the moment, we tend to see nature in cities as that what we have created and designed on purpose. And it is, in that sense, the denaturalization is actually letting other species take over. But then we're back to this other discussion, what species and what is desirable and so on. But loads of thought-provoking kind of discussion, I think, will come out of this later today. Please, another warm applause for Matthew before we welcome the next speaker as well. So thank you so much, Matthew.
Thank you.
We have here Assistant Professor Elisa Lähde from the Aalto University. She has a wide experience in the field of sustainable urban planning and green infrastructure. And in addition to finishing her PhD on co-creation and multifunctional green infrastructure last year, she has a 17-year work experience in the field, and she has done also other studies such as regional studies here in the University of Tampere. At the moment, she's working with developing and mainstreaming a new tool in Finnish land use planning, the Green Area Factor for District. But let's hear what you have to say today.
Thank you, Nina, and good morning, everybody. It's lovely to be here. It's lovely to meet you all face to face. Today I'm asking Urban Green, where are you going? And first, I will give you kind of a theoretical background about the topic. And thereafter, on the other half of the presentation, I will give you some practical examples. I'm going to give you the background through 3 different narratives. And modesty, first of them, is the history of nature. And we are looking especially 4 different points there, or 4 different kind of natures. I will come back to this framework a bit later. We will also look a bit about the history of mankind. And there are 3 points that we are especially interested: agricultural revolution, scientific revolution, and Anthropocene, the present moment. And I will also introduce the ecosystem services to you. This is probably a concept that you are familiar with, but ecosystem services are the benefits people gain from the nature. And I use the common international classification of ecosystem services, where they are categorized to 3 main categories, namely cultural services, provisioning services, and regulating and maintenance services. And when we put all 3 different narratives together, we can then ask Urban Green, where are you going? Or we can understand in a better way how we are affecting and modifying Urban Green and why. But before going there, I would like to ask you from the audience, there are 3 different creatures here: a beaver, a humankind, and an elephant. So what's common with all these 3? Any ideas? Anybody? I've been asking this from my students, and quite often they say that they are all mammals. That's true. But what else? They are all ecosystem engineers. And an ecosystem engineer is an animal that creates, significantly modifies, maintains, or destroys a habitat. These animals can have a large impact on the species richness and landscape level heterogeneity of an area. And we know that a beaver or an elephant, they tend to increase biodiversity wherever they are living, through nesting, through eating habits, or just like being around. And we know also that we humankinds, we have been mostly destroying biodiversity so far. Our impact is we create multiple impacts to our environments, but at the moment we are talking about the 6th extinction wave, and that's of course a problem. But what is important is that to kind of understand that we have the ability to create positive change. And throughout the history, we have kind of attempted to create positive change. We have attempted to create wellness, mostly for ourselves, but we just haven't maybe realized all the impacts there. But let's see, what does that mean? So the first nature, this is the concept of about different natures. It's actually created by John Hunt, a British landscape historian. He categorizes nature into 3 different categories. First, nature is basically wilderness, and it's kind of nature that's untouched by man. And we know that these kind of places don't exist that much anymore, but anyhow. This first nature was born about 3.8 billion years ago, when certain molecules combined to form a particular large structures called organisms. And that's the point basically when living entities and life began to exist. Then what happened? 12,000 years ago, there was an agricultural revolution. And it was a starting point for the second nature that consists productive landscapes of agriculture and permanent settlements. And this second nature has been created within the first nature. And now if we look at the ecosystem services and classification of those, so this second nature has a lot to do with the provisioning services. So we have been engineering our landscape and our nature so that it provides goods for us. So food, but also materials. And there's a lot of examples from this kind of approach. For example, this picture of the evolution of a corn. So you wouldn't recognize the kind of beginning point there. It doesn't resemble at all the corn that we all are familiar today. But there's a kind of process behind their interaction with human beings and kind of growth mindset also, that more is more. We have engineered entire landscapes and certain kind of habitats that are optimal providing us food. And there are quite extreme examples that you can find. And of course, we haven't been really thinking about all the impacts, what kind of impacts this development process has had on the animals, like here. Also, we have wanted to gain different kind of materials from the nature, and for example here, forestry. It's an industry. It's a science of itself. We have developed in order to gain more materials for us. Then third nature. Third nature consists of aesthetical landscapes and gardens. Gardens fell within the second nature, as the cities and towns provided spaces for the existence of the third nature. The oldest gardens have existed within palace complexes in the ancient Egypt, but also ancient Maya, Persian, and Chinese cultures have had gardens. But the kind of focus there has been the food production. And what's happened during the Renaissance? It was a time span when our society, European society, transformed from Middle Ages to modernity. And among other cultures, fields of cultures that kind of expanded, also the gardening culture developed further. And aesthetical aspects and memorability of a garden was emphasized over food cultivation. This approach was taken further by French Baroque. A garden embodied wealth, power, and human domination over nature. And then there are other examples again, like a English garden approach, and a lot of different kind of contemporary gardens, parks, and landscapes that we can see nowadays. And again, if we look at the ecosystem services, this third nature, it emphasizes the cultural services, recreation, aesthetics, inspiration, so on. And again, we have created new kind of landscapes. For example, here, tulips, they've been very appreciated, especially during the tulip mania, during the 17th century. And these kind of landscapes, they don't exist naturally or in first nature. But this is something that we have created because it pleases us. We want to have tulips in our kitchen because it looks nice. This is the garden of the French painter Claude Monet. he used to cultivate his garden in order to get inspiration and then to paint his famous paintings. And again, we can find rather extreme examples, because like it's nice to watch palm-shaped islands in a Google map, so why wouldn't we engineer such a thing? Nowadays, we also know that when we interact, when we see or smell or touch nature, it kind of creates positive impacts on us. And for that reason, there are hospital gardens where patients can go after an operation, because then they will recover quicker. So there's many kind of benefits there. Then fourth nature. This is actually not part of the original theory of John Hunt, but this has been added there later on. But the fourth nature has emerged by the current ecological crisis and the Anthropocene. It no longer is designed solely for man, but for every living creature present in that space, and the hydrological, geological, and any other natural systems linked to the space. And you might already guess that when we look at the ecosystem service circle, this approach, or the fourth nature, deals especially with the regulating and maintenance services. There's a lot of discussion and research nowadays about carbon sequestration, about microclimates and water regulation, about habitat provision, so on. What's interesting about regulating and maintenance services is that they are not visible. They can't be really consumed in the same way as, for example, food. And therefore, they have often been disregarded. For example, in land use planning, we are not really talking about these maintenance services. We might be, we have separate markings for food production areas or for recreational areas. But it's very recent discussion about like how we can impact in land use planning, for example, carbon sequestration. And normally we notice these regulating and maintenance services once we have lost them, like here. There's no erosion control left here, so we have a problem. And then we start to think that, okay, what's next? How we can fix this? Another example here, pollination. This is a picture where a man is pollinating a plant because no pollinators are left on this area. And this like makes this service, ecosystem service, visible. It also brings price for that service. Like it's quite expensive to do this by humankind, but it's a way to fix it. As we have noticed this issue, we have of course started to engineer these ecosystem services as well. There are two examples, one from Stockholm Royal Seaport area. There's a special focus on stormwater issues there. This is something that happens in quite many urban development projects nowadays, but Royal Seaport, they have quite a nice example about different stormwater management systems. And they have combined some other elements there. There's of course a lot of different kind of plants and urban biodiversity there. But you might be able to see the black hole on the bridge there behind or on the background of the picture. And that black hole is actually a tunnel for frogs, because they wanted to made it possible for frogs to live on that site. What happened then is that after the frogs, there was also snakes that came to the area. And there was a kind of research going on about the frogs and how they can then take the area and find new habitats there. And then when the snakes arrived, it kind of started to destroy that ongoing research about the frogs. So what they did, they actually put little cameras on the tunnels so they can watch whenever there's a snake coming by, and then they can catch it and take it away from the site. So kind of interesting. Another example here is also from Sweden. There's a parking house in Malmö where there's a special kind of elements engineered in order to create green walls. And also there's bird houses that are integrated on the walls of that house. And what's interesting about the bird houses is that they are a little bit different on different parts of that house in order to provide habitat for different species of birds. But what's kind of interesting here is that when we are talking about cultural services and provisioning services, as I already mentioned, it requires kind of traditional thinking, or it reflects traditional thinking. More is more, growth mindset, so on. But when we talk about these regulating and maintenance services, it's more about systems, as already mentioned today. It really requires systems thinking to increase the amount of these ecosystem services. Here is an example of that. It's Eerolanpuro wetland from Jyväskylä. This green infrastructure, it's built in order to maintain or detent and infiltrate stormwater. But in order to make it function, we need to think several different kind of things, like the amount, first of all, the amount of stormwater coming to the structure. What are the measures of this structure? How much water comes there? Is it able to take a rain event that happens once a year, or once in a 5 year, or once in a 10 years, or once in 100 years? What's the limit there? What's the amount of water? What's the quality of stormwater? Where does the water come from? Is it from the streets when the quality is not that good? Is it from the roofs when the quality of water is better? What do we do then if the quality is not good enough? Is it okay if the all kind of impurities and all that stuff that might come together with the stormwater, if it ends up here in the wetland, or do we need to have a separate structure in order to purify the water first and then conduct it in this structure? What kind of ecological connections there are? Is this structure meant to be a habitat for some species? Or are there some invasive species that we don't want to have here? What happens there? Is it part of some bigger connections? What's the accessibility of the site? Is it meant to be visited by human beings? Is it good if for example, class of pupils can go there and see the process? Or is there a risk for somebody drawing or something? Is it meant to be a recreational structure, or is it just a kind of ecological and hydrological structure? And what happens with the maintenance? Is it designed in such a way that it's easy to maintain? Is it possible to maintain with the processes that they already have in the city of Jyväskylä, or do they need to create new processes for this new kind of structure? So there's a lot of things that you need to take into consideration. And it's part of the bigger system, of course, because it's in urban settings, and you need to figure out what are the systems that are kind of interacting here. So that was the theoretical part. And now I will show you some practical examples from Finland, and they are mainly from Helsinki. There's a lot of different kind of things happening all over Finland. For example, here in Tampere, there's this Hiedanranta district, and there's a lot of interesting initiatives there also. But as I come from Helsinki, it's always easier to find examples close by. But before going to the examples, this is the one last diagram I wanted to show you. This is kind of trying to span the history of urban planning and design during the past 150 years approximately. So in the middle, there are different kind of paradigms that have existed and that have kind of steered the planning and design projects. And on the upper ground or upper level, you can see the drivers of behind their drivers that have existed. So that those different kind of paradigms have then emerged. For example, more than 100 years ago, there were in big European cities, there were problems with overcrowding, with diseases and unrest, and urban modernization was seen as an answer for that. An example there is a city of Paris, where they created these huge boulevards, and they increased also the sanitation and the training systems and so on in order to increase hygiene, and public gardens was also one of the answers there. So here on the bottom ground, you can see the different kind of aspects of well-being that been emphasized during these paradigms. And though those different aspects of well-being, they have then kind of we have noticed that we are lacking, or this kind of aspect is important for our well-being, and then since then they have kind of been part of our urban planning and design guidelines. If you look at the more recent paradigms here, for example, the resilience is something that's been discussed a lot during the last 2 years. Behind there is of course, climate adaptation. We have noticed that climate change is actually happening and it's creating risks to our living environments. But of course, pandemic is been there as well. And we have started to talk about urban resilience and how we need to create urban resilience in order to increase public safety and prevent ourselves from different kind of risks. And also this loss of biodiversity, it has started this paradigm or discussions about posthumanism. And again, there we understand that it deals also with our own well-being through biodiversity hypothesis. It's important for us to be in contact with the diverse nature and with diverse microbes in order to feel well and to stay healthy. The examples I'm going to show now come from these 4 different paradigms. The first of them is Metsälähiö, basically neighborhood in the woods in English. This is a picture from my own living room. I live in Niemenmäki, Helsinki. It's a very good example about this Metsälähiö approach, where they try to preserve woods in between the buildings. And the reason for that, or the ecosystem services that this kind of approach then delivers, are mainly the aesthetics and recreation. It was thought that it's better for people if they have a close connection to nature. Latokartano is then another example 30 years later in Helsinki. Viikki is a former agrarian area almost in the middle of the city. And the city of Helsinki then decided that they want to build a new neighborhood there. And in order to do that, they organized an architectural competition to find a good ecological solution there. There was also the University of Helsinki has a campus area there, forestry and agricultural sciences and biochemistry and what else is there. So they wanted to emphasize that kind of identity on the site as well. And the solution was kind of very concrete, green fingers coming close to the buildings, and the basic idea is that wherever you're living, nature is close by, and not only the visual aspects of the nature, but also kind of functional aspects of the nature. So there was a little attention that was paid already on stormwater management and kind of regenerative approach towards the brook that runs through the site. But also it was made possible for people to cultivate their own food there, so that they really have the connection and even kind of modest attempt to be self-sustaining on a site. So if we look at the ecosystem services here, inspiration, science, and education was emphasized here, but also the past history with the agriculture and clean water, local crops, so on. Kuninkaantammi. Again, we are leaping other 20, 30 years forward to the present moment. Kuninkaantammi is one of the recent district projects that the city of Helsinki has. There's a lot of emphasis paid on stormwater management there. It's one of the first places in Helsinki where they have tried out this green factor for plots, so that the participants that are involved in a development project of the site, they are guided this level of green factor they need to fill in order to get the license to build there. You can see this approach both on the plots. They have been using the local materials, the stones there with the stormwater management structures, and also on a streetscape. There's these kind of detention and infiltration structures where water is conducted from the streets to the rain gardens there. And also there's a kind of more systematic approach here. All the water from the site is then taken to this large park area, and the water quality and water quantities are both managed there before it goes further to Mätäjoki. It has an aspect on preventing the flood damage on the downstreams. So that's been considered as well. Vauhtitie wetland is a kind of a singular green infrastructure element close to Töölönlahti, or in the northern part of Töölönlahti in city of Helsinki. And the story there behind is that they started to build Pasila district. It used to be a cargo train cargo site, but when they started to build that area, they noticed that they are not able to deal with all the stormwater on a site. And the first idea was to conduct stormwater straight directly to Töölönlahti. But then it was noticed that, okay, there's been huge investments on water quality of Töölönlahti done in recent years, and it's not a good idea to then conduct stormwater directly from a housing area or new urban area to Töölönlahti. And they wanted to create a wetland for that purpose, so that stormwater can be purified. I was involved in this process as a landscape designer, and it was very interesting to follow the discussions, because these kind of new elements are not really tested, at least here in Finland. And there were a lot of questioning whether this element is really functioning or not. And we couldn't really kind of make sure that, okay, if we build this wetland, that it really purifies this amount of water, or it like we didn't even know what's the kind of what kind of water will then enter this wetland. And of course, we couldn't say anything about the water quality that leaves the wetland. And then it was questioned whether this structure is really needed, or if it's really functioning. Why should we invest on this kind of structure? And we needed to justify this structure through the other ecosystem services it might potentially deliver, such as habitat provision again, microclimate control. It creates kind of interesting spot on a place where didn't exist nothing interesting before. It was just purely a lawn, recreation and so on. And then it was also even discussed if this kind of structure really belongs to urban settings, because it was kind of, there were people participating in the planning process who thought that the wetland is something that belongs to agrarian landscapes. So we really had to have quite many discussions, but the end result is quite good. We still don't know if it's really purifying the water or not, but there has been discussions that it could be, some research could be done so that we would find out if it's working for that purpose or not. But at least it's collecting water from Pasila now and detaining it before it enters Töölölahti Bay. Maybe it's pure, maybe not. The ecosystem services here are the water that are emphasized are mainly water retention, water filtration in these kind of structures. And yes, we all know that this has been under a lot of discussions and piloting processes recently in Finland. Viherkatot, sorry for the Finnish topic, but green roofs, they are more and more common nowadays. There are similar kind of discussions there if they are needed, what kind of problems they might create, if they will cause some issues with the structures and the humidity. But the reason to integrate green roofs to buildings are that again water detention, but they also the care of pollinators, habitat provision again. Here on the right-hand side, you can see the big picture from the top of the Savoy restaurant. They are gardening their own herbs there, and they are providing also some honey, and that's like in the middle of city of Helsinki. So green roofs are kind of good example how you can then integrate large entities of greenery in a very densely built areas. Pollination and crops and water are the main ecosystem services that are in the focus there. Then we go into some future projects that are under the development at the moment. This Jokilaakson Kivisilta is a new housing fair site in city of Kerava. I think it's in 3 years when they are going to have a housing fair there. And the place is, or inside the site is the old Kerava Manor. And I participated in a project where we made an ecosystem service analysis for the site, or actually for the whole city of Kerava, but also we zoomed on this site, and you can see the picture there on the left side. That's from the ecosystem services analysis, and the darker the grid there is, the more ecosystem services are delivered through the green structures on that grid. So it's kind of overlay analysis where different kind of ecosystem services are analyzed separately, and then all that information is put together. But based on the ecosystem service analysis, we then recommended some principles for the future development of the site. We wanted to emphasize the continuation of the cultural and historical traditions of the region. We also wanted to strengthen the well-being of inhabitants by preserving existing habitats, the existing biodiversity and the existing soil and the food production that exists there. And we also proposed that utilizing these existing green structures, it actually helps to create an attractive identity for the region. And it also offers some answer for even for the global environmental problems, mainly by combining together the nutrient cycling, food production, and water cycles. This work was then continued by this Space and Matter Architects, a Dutch company, who made a concept design for the sites, and they are bringing out different kind of solutions in order to provide food locally, to provide energy locally, and to maintain the local biodiversity. And altogether, they are proposing these kind of cyclic processes there, where you can, instead of being just a part of a linear process, the site itself could be self-sustaining regarding water and food and so on. So this is kind of, I find this diagram rather interesting. And the ecosystem services that are emphasized here are, again, clean water, crops, nutrient retention, mediation of waste, and even noise reduction. There's a motorway passing by, and there's some focus on that as well. This is the last example. It comes from Kalasatama, Verkkosaari. There was an architectural competition there that was then resolved maybe a month ago. The winner was this Grün in der Mitte proposal by Antti Nenoiva Architects and Nomaji Architects. The idea there, or even in the competition criteria, there was mentioned that half of the kind of emphasis when they are judging all the proposals, half of the attention is paid on the aesthetical aspects and architecture of the proposal, but half of the attention is paid on the ecological proposals and the kind of sustainability of the proposal. And as a criteria there, they used again the green factor of on a plot scale. And the best proposals in the competition, they actually reached the green factor over 2, which is quite unexceptional, because in Finland, normally on a housing plot, the green factor that's is being used is 0.9. So there's a lot of more, like the amount of greenery is emphasized, but also the functions of greenery. The parking space is minimized in this proposal, and that kind of causes that there's more space for trees inside the block. And even though they have the underground parking solution there, they are able to provide good growing medium for the big trees. That means then there's a lot of potential for carbon sequestration, and especially habitat provision is being considered through different kind of habitats and different kind of like variety of plants that are proposed on a green roofs there. So the ecosystem services here are carbon sequestration, habitat provision, and even the microclimate, because we know that the urban heat island effect is happening also in Helsinki, even though that we are not maybe worried about that, not that much here in northern countries, but still with a lot of greenery we get better or more pleasant microclimate. Regarding this kind of approach with the habitat provision and urban biodiversity, there's recent news from, for example, from city of Espoo, that's gaining to be or reach biodiversity no net loss by 35, like in a scale of the whole city. So I think this is just a starting point, this Verkkosaari plot, for that kind of approach. But then if we see the whole circle of different kind of ecosystem services that can be provided in urban settings and through urban green. One thing is really kind of coming through there, and that's multifunctionality. Multifunctionality is a feature of urban green that is something that we all want, and something that is seen that is potential to achieve, but actually there's a lot of related challenges that it brings, and these are from the results from my thesis, doctoral thesis. I was able to detect three different kind of challenges related to multifunctionality. If there's a situation that we are not really understanding the whole range of different benefits that a green structure can deliver, then the understanding of multifunctionality is limited. And then also not all potential stakeholders are recognized. And this was, for example, the case of Vauhtitie wetland was showing that because we really don't understand all the different benefits, then we are not really ready to invest on these kind of structures, because we think only that, okay, that's solely for water purification. But if we start to think that it's also for well-being of the citizens and well-being of the other urban species, then we might consider that the investments that we made are more profitable. Multifunctionality also makes the measurement of the final structures and potential success more ambitious, because like we are so familiarized ourselves with this kind of traditional thinking where bigger is better, and we only have one goal where we are going. But if we have several different kind of goals or benefits that we are trying to gain, it's not always so easy to say then that, okay, we got something from that side and maybe something from that side, but was that really successful, or were we compromising too much? So we need new kind of tools to measure the success of different kind of green structures. And providing multifunctionality to match the local needs is challenging too. And here again, stormwater management is one example. When we are using the kind of traditional training systems, where we only kind of use the pipes underneath, we can only measure the pipes so that they are large enough to take the water that comes from the sites. But when we start to use different kind of nature-based solutions there, and then there's a lot of more details that we need to take into consideration, like with the example from Jyväskylä, Eerolan purokosteikko. But we really need to tailor those solutions to the local settings, and in order to do that, we need to understand the local settings. And I've noticed that, for example, the understanding of local urban ecology and the species living there and the needs that the local people might have and so on, we don't have that kind of information yet in urban planning processes, not at least in the quality or resolution of that information is not high enough. But in the end, what is important? We have the ability to create this positive change. It just requires some new kind of ways of thinking. We need to understand more deeply the factors of well-being of ourselves, but well-being of other species, well-being of planetary systems. We have to have a dialogue on the values, to whom we are creating urban spaces, why. We definitely need to do different kind of co-creational processes. We need to bring different kind of expertise together. I think that there aren't one profession that could solve all these issues, but we really need different kind of expertise and co-create new innovations. It's a bit hard because there are a lot of professions that are used to work by themselves. But when you need to kind of put together your knowledge and based on that create something new that you're maybe a bit unsure even. That's might be demanding. As I mentioned, we need to integrate more ecosystem information on urban planning process, and the level and the resolution of that information, that's kind of good enough, but it's not too detailed. That's kind of hard to define. And in the end, we need new tools and threshold values to measure the success so that we understand that, okay, this is the right path, we are going forward, and we need to continue. But I think together we can do this. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Elisa. We will take questions, but Sofie will manage the questions because I will get ready to lead you to lunch. So.
If that's even needed. So thank you so much for the talk. I'll maybe fill some space while we're waiting for any online questions or questions here. Like before, we have Dalia already, so I don't need to fill space, and also Ilona after that. Thank you, Lily.
Is this on? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I guess in a way it's for you, the question, but it also relates to this critical urban theory or this urban political ecology. But what happens, or can you comment what happens when, for example, this integration of ecosystems and so forth are used as a tool to legitimize certain agendas that, like how to deal, like, for example, you had the Kalasatama project, and yes, you say it has this, what did you say, 2% more greenery or whatever, but how that gets misused for certain political agendas.
Yeah, of course, there's a risk for that, and it's like I think we are just kind of opening the door to a huge debate. Like so far, our kind of urban history has been a history where we have created habitats for ourselves, and we have really tried to create as comfortable and as neat habitats for ourselves as possible. But then we have now noticed that it's not really possible, that this kind of what we've been doing, it's been like we have kind of crossed some sort of limit, and we are actually destroying our own well-being from the other side. And since there's a long history there, we then need to discuss that, okay, as mentioned already in a previous presentation, that what are the species and what kind of nature that we are comfortable to live with, and we are comfortable to accept in our living environments. And I think that might be a gradual process as well. And then there's, of course, a lot of different kind of opinions. There's a lot of different kind of attempts also to greenwash some things. But there aren't not any right answers or ready-made answers there, but we need to find them by ourselves. And of course, we need to be critical there to look at the kind of agenda that different stakeholders have.
Dalia did not know this, but that was going to be my filling of space, because I had a very similar question that everybody who knows me knows I love monitoring, evaluating, and being able to sort of get a sense, do things work in reality? And sort of the fact that we need to be able to value it is important to then convince other stakeholders in the current political system we have. It sort of reminds me of Matthew's follow the money kind of comment. But it also makes me actually really quite sad that we're not just doing the things because they're right. And then also when you show some of the examples, particularly Verkkosaari, having visited that admittedly 2 years ago, to then hear that he scored so well on the green factor, I'm also thinking, are they then the right tools we're using? Are they measuring the right things? Because it didn't exactly inspire. I know that the images, it comes back a bit with the examples I showed earlier, that is it greenwash? Is it really that much better? And is that the radical change that we're after? And then what tools can help us do that? And maybe if you know, is there any research happening in your area that is looking at these tools that can maybe capture the value from this multifunctionality and different stakeholders, and in a bit more of a, maybe accurate isn't the right word here, but in a way that actually we can't greenwash and use it to further the sort of slightly better than usual agendas. Yeah.
But it's really.
I'm sorry I jumped in from another question. But, yeah.
But to comment that it's kind of challenging because we know that we are in a hurry, and you can ask. I think it's very correct question to make if this is enough. No, it's not enough, but it's maybe the best that we can do at the moment, and it's creating a lot of debate already. But so. As I mentioned, I believe that we human beings, we can do it, but can we do it quickly enough? That's another question. But I think there are two modes that you can detect. And the other one is that, and it's also being discussed with the concept of ecosystem services, that it's very anthropocenic approach on nature, that it's only benefiting us. But that's kind of the language that we have nowadays, and we need to put it in that framework in order to debate these issues with the larger group of people and with the politicians. So this follow the money is one approach that we can use. But I do believe also, and I've noticed that there's we have maybe, or I want to believe that we have gained the level of well-being where we are actually not gaining any more good feelings from pampering ourselves, but we really are starting to look around and understanding that, okay, we need to take care of each other. And during the pandemics, there has been a lot of discussions about this caring. If the professions that do caring, are they paid enough, or are they valued enough? And I think also nature is part of this caring discussion, that how we are treating each other, how we are treating other species, and how we are treating non-visible processes that are important for us.
I think we then had Ilona next. Yeah. Try again.
Oh, now can you hear me? Yes. Yeah, thank you. That would have been my question, exactly what you just mentioned about the ecosystem services being a problematic and very anthropocentric concept. So I just wanted to know, do you already see ways, and of course I understand that we have to be pragmatic and take change one step at a time, but is there already let's say a paradigm shift taking place, in the sense that we go away from the idea that we integrate nature into our cities to the extent that it's functional, but that rather we think about how can we build cities that are integrated into nature in a way that we do the least harm, and that, for example, we don't build new buildings, but we think about recycling and reusing old spaces and making them more sustainable in that sense. So maybe you can comment on that from your work experience.
Yeah, well, you can definitely detect that kind of approach when we are discussing about the things, but maybe not that much on places that are realized. But of course, there's this 10 years time span that takes place before something is planned and designed and then realized. So the things that are realized at the moment, they have been designed 10 years ago. So maybe 10 years from here, we can see something different. I think it's, as I mentioned, the city of Espoo, they have made this decision to be to create biodiversity net loss by 2035. So that must then create something new and new kind of approaches on land use planning, designing, building processes. So let's see.
Could I perhaps, before we take the next one, I think if I understood correctly, I think your notion was one of we're talking about integrating nature in cities, right? And greening the cities. Actually, what you're doing is you're throwing it around on its head and saying, should it be more about integrating our cities in the natural environment? Is there any examples that you know where that's been done? If I just, because my imagination's running wild, and I'm thinking that's a super interesting flipping of the language, actually. And it changes, I think, maybe how we talk about it, as you just said. Language is something that we need to use in the current discussion.
I see cities as a kind of social ecological systems where nature and people are interacting. And this, of course, has been going on as long as people have existed. We have been interacting with the nature. So if we want to see these kind of examples where cities, or maybe not cities, but human settlements are kind of integrated into nature, then I think we could look at some of the indigenous cultures and see what has been happening there and how they have, what kind of relationship they have had with the nature, and maybe learn from there.
Okay, thank you. And I think that's then our final question, unless we still have something online waiting to come in or not.
There is no specific question, but Juho Happinen, he has provided a comment related with today's topic discussion, and is that we can't do things as the older way anymore. So we need to change, no? And he relates this conversation with one of your examples, in which new area of the single housing unit are those areas for new housing single unit feasible anymore, or we need to think about new construction? And I would love, maybe he want to develop more this comment, but it's mainly related with that. No, we need to think about new way of designing and integrating nature into the housing design.
Thank you. Perhaps then you have the mic. So sorry to keep you waiting.
Yes,
go for it.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Thanks. A lot of really good points. Maybe a little bit related to the integration of nature and urban space. Could you be able to elaborate a little bit on the role of sort of digitalization and sort of monitoring of cities through this kind of sensory data and this kind of knowledge that we need to be able to produce in order to maintain this green infrastructure, and how specifically do you evaluate in your green planning projects, do you evaluate the kind of the lifetime costs of the digitalization that we need to use in order to produce this data? So we need to kind of calculate the whole lifetime costs of this kind of digital layer that we also need to produce in order to maintain this kind of green structure.
Well, I have to say that the lifetime costs analysis, they have been very vague, unfortunately. I think we are in a phase, we are only trying to integrate these new systems and new sensors to our green environments, and we are not really, we are trying to create that, and we are not really worrying about the maintenance and the life cycle yet, because we are not quite there yet. It might come then when these new systems are getting older and not really functioning anymore, and then we start to think, oh, how should we fix this then? But I definitely think that because the systems thinking is required here, it's quite important that we utilize different kind of digital tools for measurements, and to gain different kind of data, and also to analyze that data, because it's very complex and it's kind of hard to do. And there, I think there are interesting beginnings there with the artificial intelligence, how we can utilize that in order to create more sustainable systems.
Thank you so much for that question, and I think for what the future might look like as well, and the importance of a holistic kind of view as well, and using some ways of monitoring. But this is us. If there's any more questions, Elisa actually will be around for most of the afternoon, also for lunch. Do give her a chance to have lunch as well. But if you have any other questions or topics of discussion, keep those thoughts as well among ourselves, also for the workshop. Now I hand over to Nina and lunchtime.